the heart of Afghanistan's most dangerous province, where even seasoned soldiers whispered prayers before dawn patrols, two 18-year-old twins from rural Montana were about to rewrite the rules of modern warfare. What happened over those two unforgettable nights would become legend among military circles. A story so incredible that senior commanders initially refused to believe the reports.
Marcus and Mason Riley had been dismissed, underestimated, and written off by nearly everyone at Forward Operating Base Thunder. The other soldiers called them farm boys and rookies, while their commanding officers questioned whether these identical twins from the middle of nowhere belonged in one of the most elite units in the Army. But sometimes, the most extraordinary heroes emerge from the most ordinary places. This is the true story of how two young men, armed with nothing but determination, quick thinking, and an unbreakable bond, turned what should have been a catastrophic defeat into the most talked-about military operation of the decade. It's a story about brotherhood, courage, and the moment when everything you think you know about warfare gets turned upside down by two kids who refused to accept that something was impossible. The enemy had been planning their attack for months.
Intelligence reports later revealed that over 200 highly trained insurgents had been carefully positioning themselves around the remote outpost, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They had superior numbers, better knowledge of the terrain, and the element of surprise.
Military analysts would later say it should have been a massacre, but they didn't account for the Riley twins.
And that oversight would cost them everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across Forward Operating Base Thunder, as Marcus Riley cleaned his rifle for the third time that day.
His twin brother Mason sat nearby, methodically checking ammunition counts with the same obsessive attention to detail that had driven their drill sergeants crazy back in basic training. At 18 years old, the Riley twins had been deployed to Afghanistan for exactly 43 days, and in that time they had managed to earn the contempt of nearly every soldier on the base.
"Look at the farm boys," Sergeant Davidson muttered to his squad as he walked past the twins' position. "Still think this is some kind of summer camp." The other soldiers laughed, but Marcus and Mason kept working, their faces showing no reaction to the constant mockery they endured. The twins had grown up on a cattle ranch outside Billings, Montana, where their father had raised them with old-fashioned values of hard work, respect, and never backing down from a fight. When they enlisted together right after high school, their mother had cried for 3 days straight, but their father had simply shaken their hands and told them to make him proud.
Now, thousands of miles from home, they were beginning to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. Forward Operating Base Thunder was strategically located in one of the most contested regions of Helmand Province. The base housed approximately 150 American soldiers, along with a small contingent of Afghan National Army troops. It served as a crucial supply depot and communication hub for operations throughout the region. The base was surrounded by high walls topped with razor wire, and guard towers positioned at each corner provided overlapping fields of fire across the surrounding desert landscape. The intelligence reports had been coming in for weeks, suggesting increased insurgent activity in the area. Intercepted communications indicated that enemy forces were planning something significant, but the exact nature and timing of any potential attack remained unclear. Major Hendricks, the base commander, had increased security protocols and placed additional sentries on duty, but resources were stretched thin, and morale among the troops was beginning to suffer. Marcus and Mason had volunteered for every dangerous patrol and every extra duty assignment since their arrival, hoping to prove themselves to their fellow soldiers. But their eagerness was often mistaken for naivety, and their clean-cut appearance and polite demeanor made them easy targets for ridicule. The other soldiers had dubbed them the Mormon missionaries, despite the fact that neither twin was particularly religious. On this particular evening, as the temperature began to drop and the desert wind picked up, the twins found themselves assigned to night watch duty in Tower 3, the northernmost observation post. It was considered one of the least desirable assignments, partly because it was isolated from the main base activities, and partly because the previous week insurgent snipers had taken several shots at soldiers manning that particular position. As darkness fell over the base, Marcus adjusted his night vision goggles and scanned the horizon for any signs of movement. Mason monitored the radio communications, listening to the routine check-ins from other guard positions around the perimeter. The desert at night was eerily quiet, with only the occasional sound of wind whistling through the razor wire to break the silence. "You ever think about what we're doing out here?" Mason asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the base's generators. Marcus lowered his binoculars and looked at his brother. Despite being identical twins, they had distinctly different personalities. Marcus was more impulsive and aggressive, while Mason tended to be thoughtful and analytical, but they shared an almost telepathic connection that had served them well throughout their lives. Whether they were working together to repair fence on their family ranch or covering for each other during high school football games.
Every day, Marcus replied. But Dad always said that sometimes you have to do things that don't make sense in the moment because they serve a greater purpose. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Mason noticed something unusual in the radio chatter. The routine check-ins from the other guard towers had become slightly delayed, and there seemed to be more background static than usual. He adjusted his headset and listened more carefully, trying to isolate the sounds. "Marcus," he whispered urgently. "Something's not right with the comms." His brother immediately shifted his attention from the desert to the radio equipment. They had both completed extensive communications training during their deployment preparation, and they recognized the subtle signs that their radio frequencies were being jammed or interfered with. The realization sent a chill down both of their spines. Marcus grabbed his binoculars and began systematically scanning each section of the perimeter, looking for anything out of the ordinary. The base's floodlights created pools of harsh illumination separated by deep shadows, making it difficult to detect movement beyond the wire. But years of hunting in Montana had taught both twins to recognize the subtle signs that indicated the presence of living creatures in dark environments. There, Mason pointed toward a cluster of rocks about 200 meters north of their position. "I saw something move." Marcus focused his binoculars on the area and waited patiently. After several minutes, he caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a human figure moving carefully between the rocks. Then another. And another. "We've got company," Marcus said grimly.
"Looks like at least a dozen, maybe more, moving in from the north." Mason immediately reached for the radio to report their observation to base command, but was met with nothing but static. The communication jamming was now complete, effectively cutting off Tower 3 from the rest of the base. They were on their own. The twins looked at each other, and in that moment both understood the gravity of their situation.
They were facing what appeared to be a coordinated attack by a significant enemy force, with no way to call for backup or reinforcements. Their training kicked in automatically, and they began implementing the emergency procedures they had memorized but hoped never to use. Marcus grabbed the emergency flare gun while Mason began assembling the backup radio equipment that was stored in the tower for exactly this type of situation. The backup radio operated on a different frequency and had its own power source, making it more difficult for the enemy to jam or disable. "Got it," Mason announced as he established contact with the base command center. "Tower 3 to base. We have multiple enemy contacts approaching from the north. Communications are being jammed. Request immediate backup." The response came through clearly despite some static. "Base to Tower 3, confirm your report." "How many enemy contacts?" "At least 15, possibly more," Mason replied. "They're moving in organized groups and appear to be armed with automatic weapons." There was a brief pause before the radio crackled again. "Tower 3, maintain your position and continue reporting. Backup is being organized, but it will be several minutes before additional forces can reach your location." Marcus had been continuing to monitor the approaching enemy forces through his binoculars, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The initial group of insurgents had been joined by many others, and they were now forming what appeared to be assault teams preparing for a coordinated attack on the base. "Mason, we've got a problem," Marcus said quietly. "There are a lot more than 15. I count at least 50, and they're still coming." Mason relayed this information to base command, and the response was immediate. "Tower 3, are you certain of your count?" "Affirmative," Mason replied. "Enemy forces are moving into assault positions along the entire northern perimeter. This looks like a major coordinated attack." The radio fell silent for several seconds before crackling back to life. "All positions, this is base command. We have confirmed enemy contact on the northern perimeter. All personnel to battle stations immediately." This is not a drill. Suddenly the desert exploded in gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as dozens of insurgent fighters opened fire simultaneously on multiple sections of the base perimeter. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of automatic weapons fire, punctuated by the distinctive crack of sniper rifles and the dull thump of rocket-propelled grenades. Tower 3 immediately became a primary target. Bullets began striking the concrete walls around the twins, sending chips of masonry flying through the air. Marcus and Mason dropped to the floor of the tower and crawled toward their defensive positions, keeping as low as possible while still maintaining the ability to return fire. "This is it," Marcus shouted over the gunfire. "Everything we trained for." Mason nodded and checked his weapon one final time. The M4 carbine felt familiar and reassuring in his hands, despite the chaos erupting around them. He had fired thousands of rounds during training, but this was the first time he had ever pointed his weapon at another human being with the intention of pulling the trigger. The twins had developed their own system of communication during training, using hand signals and subtle movements that allowed them to coordinate their actions without verbal communication. This skill became invaluable as the noise of battle made normal conversation impossible.
Marcus pointed toward a cluster of enemy fighters who were attempting to breach the wire barrier directly in front of their position. Mason nodded and adjusted his aim, waiting for the perfect moment to engage.
Both twins understood that their success depended not just on their individual skills, but on their ability to work together as a perfectly coordinated team. The first insurgent to come within range was a tall man carrying an AK-47 and what appeared to be several grenades attached to his vest. He was moving quickly and confidently, clearly believing that the defenders were either dead or too suppressed to return effective fire. He was wrong. Mason's first shot took the insurgent in the center of his chest, dropping him immediately. Marcus engaged a second target, then a third. Within seconds, the twins had established a devastating crossfire that stopped the enemy advance in its tracks. But the insurgents quickly adapted their tactics. Instead of continuing the frontal assault, they began using cover and concealment to approach the tower from multiple directions simultaneously. It was a classic military maneuver designed to overwhelm the defenders through superior numbers and coordinated attacks. The twins found themselves fighting on three sides of their position, constantly shifting their attention from one threat to another. Their ammunition was limited, and they knew that they had to make every shot count. The training they had received in marksmanship and fire control became crucial as they carefully selected targets and avoided wasting precious ammunition on difficult or uncertain shots. As the battle continued, Marcus noticed that the enemy forces were not just randomly attacking the base, they were following a specific plan, with different groups assigned to different objectives.
Some were trying to breach the perimeter defenses, while others appeared to be positioning themselves to attack the base's critical infrastructure, including the communications center and the ammunition depot. "They're not just trying to overrun us," Marcus shouted to his brother during a brief lull in the firing.
"This is a coordinated operation with specific targets." Mason nodded, understanding the implications immediately. If the insurgents succeeded in destroying the base's communication capabilities and ammunition supplies, the defenders would be effectively neutralized even if they managed to survive the initial assault. The twins made a decision that would define the rest of their military careers. Instead of simply defending their assigned position, they began to take the initiative, using their elevated position in the tower to identify and engage enemy leaders and key targets. They focused their fire on insurgents carrying heavy weapons, radio equipment, and explosive devices, systematically disrupting the enemy's coordination and reducing their offensive capabilities. Their tactics worked. Within 30 minutes of the start of the attack, the insurgent assault had been broken into several smaller, uncoordinated groups that were much easier for the base defenders to handle. The twins had effectively transformed what should have been a catastrophic defeat into a manageable defensive battle. But the night was far from over. As the immediate threat diminished, Marcus and Mason began to realize that the attack they had just repelled was only the beginning. Intelligence reports intercepted during the battle indicated that this had been a probing attack designed to test the base's defenses and identify weaknesses that could be exploited in a larger, more devastating assault planned for the following night. The twins looked at each other as the desert gradually returned to its normal quiet state. They were exhausted, their uniforms were torn and dirty, and their ammunition supplies were running dangerously low. But they were alive, and their actions had prevented what could have been a disaster for forward operating base Thunder. As dawn broke over the mountains to the east, casting the first light of a new day across the battlefield, Marcus and Mason Riley began to understand that their real test was still ahead of them. The enemy would return, and next time they would be better prepared and more determined than ever. The farm boys from Montana had survived their first night of real combat, but the whispers they had heard from captured insurgents during the aftermath chilled them to the bone. "Don't even try tomorrow night. We will finish what we started." The twins had no intention of making it easy for them. The morning sun revealed the full scope of what had happened during the night. Scattered across the desert floor beyond the perimeter wire lay evidence of the fierce battle that had taken place. Empty shell casings glinted in the early light, and several pieces of abandoned enemy equipment marked the spots where insurgent fighters had been forced to retreat under the devastating fire from Tower 3. Major Hendricks stood in the center of the base compound, surveying the damage and listening to reports from his section leaders. 3 soldiers had been wounded during the attack, but miraculously, there had been no fatalities among the American forces. The Afghan National Army troops had performed well, maintaining their assigned positions and providing effective supporting fire throughout the engagement. "Bring me the Riley twins," the major ordered his aide. "I want to hear their report firsthand." Marcus and Mason were still in Tower 3, methodically cleaning their weapons and restocking their ammunition supplies. Neither had spoken much since the battle ended, each lost in his own thoughts about what they had experienced and what it might mean for their future. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving them feeling drained and slightly shaky, but also strangely confident in a way they had never felt before. When the summons came from base command, the twins made their way across the compound with steady steps, ignoring the stares and whispers from other soldiers who had witnessed their performance during the night.
The same men who had mocked them as farm boys and rookies just 24 hours earlier were now looking at them with something approaching respect, and in some cases genuine awe. Major Hendricks was a career officer with 22 years of military experience, including multiple combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. He had seen plenty of young soldiers rise to the occasion during their first taste of real combat, but what the Riley twins had accomplished was something extraordinary. According to the preliminary battle damage assessment, their accurate and disciplined fire had been responsible for breaking up the main enemy assault and preventing what could have been a catastrophic breach of the base's defenses.
Soldiers, the major began as the twins entered his command bunker. I've been reviewing the reports from last night's action, and I want you to walk me through exactly what happened from your perspective.
Marcus and Mason took turns describing the events of the previous night, from their initial detection of enemy movement through the final stages of the battle. They spoke clearly and concisely, sticking to the facts and avoiding any embellishment or self-promotion. Their account matched perfectly with the observations of other defenders and the intelligence gathered from intercepted enemy communications. According to our analysts, Major Hendricks continued after they had finished their report. You two were responsible for eliminating or wounding approximately 15 enemy combatants, including at least 3 squad leaders and 2 heavy weapons specialists. Your actions directly prevented the enemy from achieving their primary objectives and forced them to withdraw earlier than planned. The twins exchanged glances but remained silent, waiting for their commanding officer to continue.
However, the major's tone became more serious. We have intelligence indicating that last night was only a preliminary attack. The enemy is regrouping, and they're planning something much larger for tonight. Our sources suggest they're bringing in additional fighters, heavier weapons, and possibly even suicide bombers. Mason felt his stomach tighten at the mention of suicide bombers.
During their training, they had learned about the devastating effectiveness of these tactics in previous conflicts, and the thought of facing such determined enemies was deeply unsettling.
Sir, Marcus spoke up. What are our options?
Can we call in additional support or request evacuation? Major Hendricks shook his head grimly. The nearest reinforcements are more than 100 miles away, and the weather forecast shows a major sandstorm moving through the region tonight. Air support will be limited or possibly unavailable entirely. We're going to have to handle this with the resources we have.
The reality of their situation was becoming clear to both twins. They were essentially trapped in an isolated outpost, facing an enemy force of unknown size and capability, with limited support and no possibility of retreat.
It was exactly the kind of scenario that military planners used in worst-case training exercises, except this time it was real. I'm reassigning both of you to special duties for today, the major announced.
I want you to work with Sergeant Martinez to develop defensive plans for tonight's attack. Your performance last night demonstrates that you have a natural tactical instinct, and I want to make use of that. Sergeant Carlos Martinez was a veteran non-commissioned officer with extensive combat experience in urban warfare. He had been skeptical of the Riley twins when they first arrived at the base, but their performance during the previous night's battle had completely changed his opinion.
As he led them to the tactical planning area, he began to see them not as inexperienced rookies but as valuable assets who might hold the key to surviving the coming assault. All right, boys, Martinez began as he spread a detailed map of the base and surrounding area across a folding table. Let's start with what we learned last night. The enemy's main approach was from the north, using the rocky terrain for cover and concealment. They showed good tactical coordination and had obviously studied our defensive positions in advance. Marcus studied the map carefully, noting the elevation changes and natural obstacles that had channeled the enemy's advance during the previous night. His years of hunting in Montana had taught him to read terrain like a book, understanding how geography could be used both defensively and offensively.
Sergeant, Marcus said, pointing to a narrow canyon that ran parallel to the base's northern perimeter. If they're planning a larger attack, they'll need to move more men and heavier equipment. This canyon is the only route that can accommodate that kind of movement without exposing them to observation from our towers.
Martinez nodded approvingly. Good eye.
That's exactly what our intelligence suggests. They'll likely use that canyon to position their main assault force, then launch simultaneous attacks from multiple directions to overwhelm our defenses. Mason had been studying a different section of the map, focusing on the base's internal layout and defensive positions. What about our ammunition depot and communications center? He asked.
If I were planning this attack, those would be my primary targets. Destroy our ability to communicate and resupply, and the base becomes indefensible.
That's advanced tactical thinking, Martinez admitted with surprise. Most soldiers with years of experience don't immediately grasp the importance of those secondary targets. The three men spent the next several hours developing a comprehensive defensive plan that took into account the lessons learned from the previous night's battle.
They identified key positions that needed to be reinforced, established fields of fire that would create overlapping kill zones, and developed contingency plans for various attack scenarios. But as the day wore on, it became clear that their defensive preparations alone would not be sufficient to repel a major assault by a well-equipped enemy force. They were simply outnumbered and outgunned, and even the most brilliant defensive tactics could not overcome such overwhelming odds. "We need to think outside the box," Mason suggested during a brief break in their planning session.
Instead of just waiting for them to attack us, what if we could disrupt their preparations or force them to change their plans? Marcus immediately understood what his brother was suggesting.
You're talking about a preemptive strike. Exactly, Mason replied.
"If we can identify their staging areas and hit them before they're ready to launch their main attack, we might be able to level the playing field." Sergeant Martinez looked skeptical. "That's a dangerous proposition. We'd be sending a small force outside the wire, into enemy territory, with limited support and no guarantee of success. If something went wrong, we could lose our best soldiers right before the main attack." But Major Hendricks, who had been listening to their discussion from across the command bunker, was intrigued by the idea.
"Tell me more about what you're thinking,"
he said, walking over to join their planning session. Marcus pointed to the map, tracing the route that the enemy forces would most likely use to approach the base. "Based on what we observed last night, they're staging their forces in this area." He indicated a cluster of buildings about 3 miles north of the base. "If a small team could infiltrate that area and conduct a surgical strike against their command and control elements, it might buy us enough time to improve our defensive positions and call in additional support." "It's risky," Major Hendricks agreed, "but it might be our best option. The question is, who would lead such a mission?" Marcus and Mason looked at each other, and both knew instantly what the other was thinking. They had trained for exactly this type of operation. They knew the terrain better than anyone else on the base after their night-long observation of the enemy's movement patterns. And most importantly, they worked together with a level of coordination that would be essential for such a dangerous mission.
"We'll do it," Marcus said simply. "My brother and I." Major Hendricks studied both twins carefully.
Less than 24 hours earlier, he would have dismissed such a suggestion immediately, but their performance during the previous night's battle had demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond what their age and experience would normally suggest. They had shown exceptional marksmanship, tactical awareness, and courage under fire. More importantly, they had proven that they could maintain their composure and make sound decisions in life-or-death situations. "This isn't a video game or a training exercise," the major warned them. "If you're captured, the enemy will not treat you according to the Geneva Convention. If you are wounded, we may not be able to extract you. And if something goes wrong, you'll be on your own with no backup and no support." "We understand the risks, sir," Mason replied. "But we also understand what will happen if we don't try. The base will be overrun, and a lot of good soldiers will die. We can't just sit here and wait for that to happen."
The major made his decision.
"All right. You have until 1800 hours to plan your mission and prepare your equipment. Sergeant Martinez will provide you with whatever support you need. But remember, this is a reconnaissance and disruption mission, not a suicide attack. Your primary objective is to gather intelligence and, if possible, disrupt the enemy's preparations. Do not engage in prolonged firefights and do not take unnecessary risks." As word of the twins' upcoming mission spread through the base, the atmosphere began to change noticeably.
The other soldiers, many of whom had been dismissive or even hostile toward Marcus and Mason just days earlier, now sought them out to offer advice, share equipment, or simply wish them luck.
The transformation was remarkable and revealed the fundamental respect that warriors have for courage and competence, regardless of age or background. Corporal Jenkins, a sniper who had initially been one of the twins' harshest critics, approached them as they were preparing their gear for the mission.
"I heard what you boys are planning to do," he said quietly. "I want you to take this." He handed Marcus a high-quality scope that had been specially modified for low-light conditions.
"It's never let me down, and I have a feeling you might need it tonight." Similar offers of assistance came from throughout the base. The communications specialist provided them with encrypted radios and emergency beacon equipment.
The explosives expert gave them detailed instructions on how to identify and neutralize enemy ammunition supplies. The medic equipped them with advanced first aid supplies and showed them techniques for treating severe wounds under combat conditions.
But perhaps the most significant support came from an unexpected source. As the twins were conducting their final equipment check, Major Hendricks approached them with a sealed envelope. "These are your official orders," he explained. "If something happens to me during tonight's attack, whoever assumes command will need to understand what you were doing and why. But there's something else." He handed them a second envelope. "These are letters I wrote to your parents. If you don't make it back, I want them to know that their sons died as heroes, fighting to save the lives of their fellow soldiers." Marcus and Mason accepted the envelopes without comment, but both understood the gravity of what they represented. This was no longer just a military mission. It had become a test of everything they believed in and everything they had been taught about duty, courage, and sacrifice. As the sun began to set over the desert, casting long shadows across the base compound, the twins completed their final preparations. They had studied satellite photos of the target area, memorized contingency plans for various scenarios, and synchronized their watches with the base's communication schedule. Their equipment had been checked and double-checked, and their weapons had been zeroed to ensure maximum accuracy. But beyond all the technical preparations, Marcus and Mason had also spent time preparing themselves mentally and emotionally for what lay ahead.
They talked quietly about their family back in Montana, about the values their parents had instilled in them, and about their responsibilities to their fellow soldiers. They acknowledged their fear without being paralyzed by it, and they drew strength from their unshakable bond as brothers.
As darkness fell over Forward Operating Base Thunder, the twins made their way to the northern gate where Sergeant Martinez was waiting with a small team of volunteers who would provide covering fire during their initial movement toward enemy territory. The base's floodlights had been dimmed to reduce the twins' visibility as they prepared to slip through the perimeter wire and disappear into the desert night. "Remember," Martinez said quietly, "you have exactly 4 hours to complete your mission and return to base. After that, we'll be too busy with our own battle to provide any support." Marcus nodded and checked his watch one final time. "We'll be back," he said simply. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the base and venture into hostile territory, both twins felt the weight of responsibility that had been placed on their shoulders. The success or failure of their mission might determine whether Forward Operating Base Thunder survived the coming assault. More importantly, it might determine whether their fellow soldiers lived to see another dawn. The desert night was clear and cold, with a million stars visible in the unpolluted sky. In a few hours, this peaceful landscape would once again become a battlefield. But for now, it belonged to two young men from Montana who were about to attempt something that military historians would later describe as either brilliant or insane, depending on the outcome. Marcus and Mason Riley stepped through the wire and vanished into the darkness, carrying with them the hopes and prayers of every soldier on the base. Behind them, the preparations for the final battle continued, but everyone understood that the twins' mission might be their last best chance for survival. The second night was about to begin, and this time, the stakes could not be higher. The desert at night was a different world entirely. Without the base's floodlights and the constant hum of generators, Marcus and Mason found themselves immersed in a silence so complete that they could hear their own heartbeats. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and their breath formed small clouds in the cold air as they moved carefully across the rocky terrain toward their target. They had been walking for approximately 40 minutes when Mason suddenly held up his hand, signaling for his brother to stop. Both twins dropped to the ground and remained motionless, listening intently for whatever had caught Mason's attention. After several minutes of absolute stillness, they heard it. The distant sound of voices speaking in what sounded like Arabic, carried on the night wind from somewhere ahead of their position. Marcus pulled out his binoculars and carefully scanned the area in the direction of the voices. Through the green haze of his night vision equipment, he could make out what appeared to be a cluster of abandoned buildings about half a mile ahead. More importantly, he could see the distinctive signatures of several vehicles parked behind the structures, and the movement of multiple human figures between the buildings. The twins had found the enemy's staging area. Mason activated his radio and whispered a brief report back to base command. "Wolfpack to Thunder Base. We have located the primary target. Multiple enemy personnel and vehicles confirmed. Beginning detailed reconnaissance." The response came through clearly despite the distance. "Thunder Base to Wolfpack. Understood. Proceed with caution and report any significant developments." Moving with the stealth they had learned during countless hunting trips in the mountains of Montana, Marcus and Mason began their approach toward the enemy camp. They used every piece of available cover, moving from rock to rock and taking advantage of the natural shadows created by the moonlight. Their progress was slow and methodical, but it was also completely silent. As they got closer to the buildings, the scope of the enemy preparation became apparent. This was not just a temporary staging area. It was a full-scale forward operating base with sophisticated communication equipment. heavy weapons, and what appeared to be several hundred fighters. The twins counted at least 20 vehicles, including several that looked like they might be carrying rocket launchers or other heavy weapon systems. But what truly shocked them was the level of organization and planning that was evident throughout the camp. This was clearly not a hastily assembled group of insurgent fighters. It was a well-equipped and professionally trained military force that had been preparing for this operation for weeks or possibly months. Marcus focused his binoculars on what appeared to be the main command post, located in the largest of the abandoned buildings. Through a partially open window, he could see several men gathered around what looked like a map table, apparently conducting a final briefing before the upcoming attack. The body language and positioning of these individuals suggested that they were senior commanders or specialists rather than ordinary fighters. "Mason," he whispered, "take a look at the command post. These guys are professionals." His brother adjusted his own binoculars and studied the scene for several minutes. When he lowered the equipment, his expression was grim. "This isn't just an attack," he said quietly. "This is a full-scale military operation. They're planning to destroy the base completely and probably use it as their own forward position." The implications were staggering. If this enemy force succeeded in overrunning forward operating base Thunder, they would gain control of a strategic location that could be used to launch attacks against other American positions throughout the region. The base's communication equipment, weapons, and supplies would all fall into enemy hands, providing them with resources that could be used against American forces for months to come. Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of simply gathering intelligence and returning to base as ordered, he was going to attempt to disrupt the enemy's operation in a way that would give the defenders a fighting chance. "We need to take out their communications," he told his brother. "If we can prevent them from coordinating their attack, their numerical superiority becomes much less effective." Mason understood immediately what his brother was suggesting. It would require them to infiltrate the enemy camp, locate and destroy their communication equipment, and then escape without being detected or captured. The odds of success were minimal, and the consequences of failure would be catastrophic for both of them and for the soldiers back at the base. "It's suicide," Mason whispered. "There are too many of them and we have no backup plan if something goes wrong." "Maybe," Marcus replied, "but if we don't try, everyone at the base dies tonight. At least this way, we're giving them a chance." The twins spent the next 30 minutes studying the enemy camp in detail, identifying patrol routes, guard positions, and potential approaches to the command post. They noted the timing of the guards' movements and identified several blind spots in the camp's security that could be exploited by determined infiltrators. Their plan was simple but extremely dangerous. Marcus would create a diversion on the western edge of the camp, drawing the attention of the guards and hopefully causing them to reposition their security forces. While the enemy was responding to this distraction, Mason would approach the command post from the east, destroy the communication equipment, and attempt to eliminate any senior commanders who might be present. The success of their mission depended on precise timing, flawless execution, and a considerable amount of luck. But both twins understood that sometimes desperate situations required desperate measures. And this was definitely one of those times. At exactly 2:30 a.m., Marcus began his approach to the western perimeter of the enemy camp. He carried several small explosive devices that had been provided by the base's demolitions expert, along with his standard combat equipment. His objective was to create enough noise and confusion to draw attention away from his brother's infiltration route. Mason waited in position on the eastern side of the camp, watching for Marcus's signal and preparing to begin his own approach to the command post. He carried specialized equipment for destroying electronic devices, as well as his rifle and sidearm. His mission was more complex and dangerous than his brother's, requiring him to penetrate deeper into the enemy camp and remain undetected for a longer period. The first explosion erupted on the western edge of the camp at exactly 2:45 a.m. Marcus had successfully positioned and detonated one of his explosive devices near what appeared to be a fuel storage area, creating a spectacular fireball that lit up the entire camp. The reaction from the enemy forces was immediate and exactly what the twins had hoped for. Dozens of fighters rushed toward the explosion site, leaving other areas of the camp temporarily unguarded. Mason began his infiltration immediately, moving quickly but carefully toward the command post building. The explosion had created enough chaos and confusion to mask the sounds of his movement, and the flickering light from the burning fuel made it easier for him to avoid detection by using the constantly shifting shadows for concealment. He reached the command post building just as Marcus detonated his second explosive device, creating another massive distraction on the opposite side of the camp. Through the partially open window, Mason could see that the enemy commanders were frantically trying to organize a response to what they believed was an attack by a much larger force. This was his opportunity. Mason slipped through the window and found himself in a room filled with sophisticated communication equipment, detailed maps of the region, and several enemy personnel who were too focused on the crisis outside to notice his presence. He immediately began planting explosive charges on the radio equipment, while simultaneously photographing the maps and documents with a small camera he carried for intelligence-gathering purposes. The explosive charges were designed to detonate with a 5-minute delay, giving Mason enough time to escape from the building before they destroyed the enemy's communication capabilities. But as he was preparing to leave through the same window he had used to enter, one of the enemy commanders turned around and saw him. The next few seconds were a blur of violent action. The enemy commander shouted a warning to his colleagues, while simultaneously reaching for his weapon. Mason had no choice but to engage in close-quarters combat, using the hand-to-hand fighting techniques he had learned during his military training to neutralize the threat before it could alert the entire camp to his presence. The fight was brief but brutal. Mason's training and physical conditioning gave him a significant advantage over his opponent, but the noise of the struggle had attracted the attention of other enemy personnel in the building. He could hear footsteps approaching from the adjacent room, and he knew that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing. He grabbed several of the most important-looking documents from the map table and headed for the window, but before he could escape, 2 more enemy fighters entered the room. Mason found himself trapped with no choice but to fight his way out. Meanwhile, Marcus had successfully detonated his third and final explosive device. But the enemy forces were beginning to organize a systematic search of the area around the camp. He could see flashlights and hear voices coming from multiple directions, indicating that his diversionary tactics had been successful, but were now creating danger for both himself and his brother.
He activated his radio and whispered urgently, "Wolf 2 to Wolf 1, I'm compromised. Multiple enemy forces converging on my position.
What's your status?" The response came immediately. "Wolf 1 to Wolf 2, I'm in the command post, but I've been detected. Enemy forces are moving to surround the building. I need an extraction route, now."
Marcus didn't hesitate. Despite the extreme danger to his own life, he immediately began moving toward his brother's position, using the confusion and chaos in the camp to mask his approach.
He could see that several enemy fighters were taking up positions around the command post building, apparently preparing to storm the structure and capture or kill whoever was inside. The explosive charges that Mason had planted in the communication equipment detonated at exactly 3 a.m., destroying not only the radio systems but also causing significant structural damage to the command post building. The explosion created a momentary diversion that allowed Mason to escape through the window. But he immediately found himself facing several enemy fighters who had been positioned outside as security. The firefight that followed was intense but brief. Mason's superior marksmanship training and the advantage of surprise allowed him to neutralize the immediate threats, but he knew that more enemy forces would be converging on his position within minutes. He needed to reach the extraction point where his brother was supposed to be waiting. Marcus had positioned himself approximately 200 meters from the command post building, in a location that provided good cover and clear fields of fire toward the enemy camp. When he saw his brother emerge from the building and begin taking fire from multiple directions, he immediately began engaging the enemy fighters with precision rifle fire, systematically eliminating the threats that posed the greatest danger to Mason's escape. The coordination between the twins during this firefight was remarkable. Without any direct communication, they managed to establish overlapping fields of fire that allowed Mason to move from cover to cover while Marcus provided suppressive fire against enemy positions. Their years of hunting together had taught them to anticipate each other's movements and coordinate their actions with an almost telepathic level of understanding. But the enemy forces were beginning to organize a more effective response to the attack. Radio communications from other parts of their network were reporting the destruction of the command post, and reinforcements were being dispatched from nearby positions to surround and eliminate the infiltrators. "Wolf 2 to Wolf 1, Marcus whispered into his radio. "We need to get out of here now. Enemy reinforcements are moving in from the north and east." "Wolf 1 to Wolf 2, Mason replied. "I'm moving to your position now. Be ready to provide covering fire." The next few minutes were among the most dangerous of both twins' lives. Mason had to cross approximately 150 meters of open ground while under fire from multiple enemy positions, relying entirely on his brother's marksmanship skills to keep the enemy forces suppressed long enough for him to reach safety. Marcus rose slightly from his concealed position and began engaging enemy targets with rapid, accurate fire. His rifle shots rang out across the desert night, each one carefully aimed at a specific threat to his brother's movement. He could see Mason moving from rock to rock, using every piece of available cover while the enemy bullets struck the ground around him, sending up small puffs of dust and rock fragments. When Mason finally reached his brother's position, both twins were breathing heavily and running dangerously low on ammunition. They had successfully completed their primary mission of destroying the enemy's communication capabilities, but they were now trapped in hostile territory with a significant enemy force actively hunting for them.
"We need to move," Marcus said quietly. "They'll have this area surrounded within 10 minutes.
The twins began their withdrawal toward forward operating base Thunder, but they quickly realized that their situation had become much more complicated. The destruction of the enemy's communication equipment had apparently triggered contingency plans that involved immediately launching the main attack against the base, even without proper coordination between different enemy units. As they moved across the desert, Marcus and Mason could see muzzle flashes and explosions in the distance, indicating that the battle for the base had already begun. They were no longer conducting a reconnaissance mission. They were racing to return to their fellow soldiers who were fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. "Thunder Base to Wolfpack." The radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Base Command. "We are under heavy attack from multiple directions.
What is your current position and estimated time of arrival?"
"Wolfpack to Thunder Base," Mason responded. "We are approximately 2 miles north of your position and moving as fast as possible. We have successfully completed our primary mission, but the enemy has initiated their main attack ahead of schedule." "Thunder Base to Wolfpack," came the immediate reply. "Understood. Be advised that the northern approach route is heavily contested. You may need to find an alternative route back to base." The twins looked at each other and shared a moment of grim understanding.
They had succeeded in disrupting the enemy's coordinated attack plan, but in doing so, they had also triggered a desperate and potentially more dangerous assault against their fellow soldiers. The enemy forces, deprived of their communication capabilities and facing the failure of their carefully planned operation, had apparently decided to launch an all-out attack in the hope of achieving their objectives through sheer force and determination. Marcus and Mason began moving toward the base at a faster pace, but they also started encountering enemy forces that had been positioned along the most direct routes. It became clear that they would have to fight their way through multiple enemy positions in order to reach the base and rejoin the main battle. The final approach to forward operating Base Thunder took the twins through a series of running firefights with enemy forces who were also moving toward the base for the main assault. In several cases, Marcus and Mason found themselves attacking enemy units from behind, disrupting their advance and creating confusion about the size and location of American forces in the area. By the time they reached the base perimeter, the main battle was in full swing. Enemy forces were attacking from 3 different directions simultaneously, using rocket-propelled grenades, mortars, and coordinated small arms fire to try to overwhelm the defenders. But without their communication equipment, the enemy units were unable to coordinate their attacks effectively, and the base's defenders were able to concentrate their defensive fire against each attack individually. Marcus and Mason slipped through the perimeter wire and immediately reported to Major Hendricks in the command bunker. The Major's face showed obvious relief when he saw that both twins had returned safely, but there was no time for detailed debriefings or congratulations. "Report," the Major ordered tersely, as explosions continued to rock the base. "Primary mission accomplished," Marcus replied. "Enemy communication capabilities have been destroyed, and we have intelligence indicating significant confusion in their command structure. However, they have initiated their main attack earlier than planned, apparently as a desperate measure to salvage their operation." Major Hendricks nodded grimly. "We can see the results of your work. Their attacks are uncoordinated and less effective than we had expected. But they still have superior numbers, and they're fighting with the desperation of people who know this is their last chance." The twins were immediately assigned to Tower 3 again, the same position they had defended during the first night's battle, but this time they were joined by additional soldiers and provided with heavier weapons, including a machine gun and several cases of ammunition. The second major assault against forward operating Base Thunder lasted for nearly 4 hours and was far more intense than the first night's action. Enemy forces repeatedly attempted to breach the perimeter wire, using explosives and coordinated small arms fire to suppress the defenders, while assault teams tried to establish footholds inside the base. But the destruction of their communication equipment had a devastating impact on the enemy's effectiveness. Units that should have been coordinating their attacks were instead fighting independent battles, allowing the defenders to defeat them piecemeal rather than being overwhelmed by simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. Marcus and Mason once again distinguished themselves during the battle, using their elevated position in Tower 3 to identify and engage high-priority targets throughout the enemy force. Their accurate fire disrupted multiple enemy attacks and helped maintain the integrity of the base's defensive perimeter during several critical moments when the outcome of the battle hung in the balance. As dawn broke over the desert for the second time, the enemy forces finally began to withdraw. Their casualties had been severe, their objectives had not been achieved,
and their organizational structure had been effectively destroyed by the loss of their communication capabilities. The few surviving enemy fighters disappeared into the desert, leaving behind a battlefield littered with abandoned equipment and clear evidence of a decisive defeat. Forward Operating Base Thunder had not only survived the two-night assault, it had inflicted such severe casualties on the enemy force that subsequent intelligence reports indicated it would be months before they could organize another major offensive in the region. Major Hendricks called the entire base together for an impromptu ceremony as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. Standing before the assembled soldiers, he began to speak about courage, dedication, and the extraordinary performance of duty under the most challenging circumstances. During the past 48 hours, the Major announced, this base has faced the most serious threat in its operational history. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy force that had been planning this operation for months. By all conventional military analysis, we should have been overrun. He paused and looked directly at Marcus and Mason, who were standing at attention with the rest of their unit. But conventional analysis does not account for the extraordinary courage and tactical brilliance demonstrated by Private Marcus Riley and Private Mason Riley. These two young soldiers not only defended their assigned position with exceptional skill during the first night's battle, but they also volunteered for and successfully completed one of the most dangerous reconnaissance missions I have ever authorized. The Major went on to describe the twins' infiltration of the enemy camp, the destruction of the communication equipment, and their fighting withdrawal under fire. As he spoke, the other soldiers began to understand the full scope of what the Riley twins had accomplished, and the decisive impact their actions had on the outcome of both battles. The enemy forces we faced were professional soldiers with extensive training and sophisticated equipment, Major Hendricks continued. They had every advantage except one. They underestimated the fighting spirit and tactical capability of American soldiers. Specifically, they underestimated two young men from Montana who refused to accept that their situation was hopeless. When the ceremony concluded, Marcus and Mason found themselves surrounded by their fellow soldiers, many of whom wanted to shake their hands, slap them on the back, or simply express their gratitude for actions that had undoubtedly saved lives throughout the base. Sergeant Martinez, who had been instrumental in planning the twins' infiltration mission, pulled them aside for a private conversation. I've been in this business for 15 years, he told them, and I've never seen anything like what you two accomplished. You didn't just complete a mission, you changed the entire course of this battle and probably saved this base. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Corporal Jenkins, the sniper who had initially been one of their harshest critics, approached them as they were cleaning their equipment after the ceremony.
I owe you boys an apology,
he said quietly. When you first arrived here, I thought you were just a couple of farm kids who didn't belong in a combat zone. I was wrong. You're warriors, and it's been an honor to serve alongside you. The twins accepted these expressions of gratitude and respect with the same quiet dignity they had shown throughout their deployment. They understood that they had been tested under the most extreme circumstances possible and had proven themselves worthy of the trust and confidence their fellow soldiers had placed in them. Later that day, as reports of the successful defense of Forward Operating Base Thunder reached higher levels of command, both Marcus and Mason received official commendations for their actions during the two-night battle. But more importantly, they had earned something that could not be awarded or taken away: the absolute respect of every soldier who had witnessed their courage and competence under fire. The enemy forces that had whispered, "Don't even try," had been proven wrong in the most decisive way possible. The Riley twins had not only tried, they had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations, transforming what should have been a catastrophic defeat into one of the most remarkable defensive victories in recent military history. Years later, when military historians studied the battle for Forward Operating Base Thunder, they would identify the destruction of the enemy's communication capabilities as the single most important factor in the successful defense of the base. But the soldiers who were there would always remember something more personal and more inspiring: the sight of two young men from rural Montana who refused to be intimidated by impossible odds and who risked everything to save the lives of their fellow soldiers. Marcus and Mason Riley had arrived at Forward Operating Base Thunder as inexperienced rookies who were dismissed and underestimated by nearly everyone around them. They left as heroes whose actions had literally changed the course of military history in that region. The farm boys from Montana had become legends, and their story would be told and retold wherever soldiers gathered to share tales of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood in the face of overwhelming adversity.